Hello, welcome to this presentation on 4 approaches to corporate social responsibility. We begin with this diagram, and what I'm going to suggest throughout this presentation is that all forms of corporate social responsibility could be roughly categorized within these 4 groups. Moreover, with the exception of the market approach, it would be possible to combine elements of the other 3 approaches together into hybrid forms. But let's begin with the central continuum that you see between the market approach on the left and the regulatory approach on the right. This central continuum would represent the degree to which government is involved in the economy. In the market approach, that involvement would be very slight. In the regulatory approach, though, the degree of government involvement in the economy would be much more substantial. Now, above that continuum, yet and off the continuum, is the corporate conscience approach. And we'll see this is a very much of a values-oriented approach to thinking individually about how each corporation understands its responsibility to society. And then the stakeholder approach would be below the continuum, representing a different approach, a more adequate and cohesive approach to thinking about the need for stakeholder involvement in corporate decisions and or at least taking stakeholder concerns and interest into account. So we begin with the market approach on the left side of the continuum. Now, the market approach holds that companies have as their primary responsibility to society the task of producing goods and services that are offered in a competitive marketplace for a very good price of high quality, and that consists of their sole responsibility to society. Another way to think about this is the sole responsibility of companies is to make a profit. Again, thinking about how companies interact with one another in a competitive marketplace to respond to consumers voting with their dollars so that the desirable goods are in the marketplace for people to consume. Undoubtedly, Milton Friedman was the strongest proponent of this approach to corporate social responsibility. And in fact, an editorial that he published in the New York Times in 1970 really became the basis of this philosophy of corporate social responsibility, even though he had echoed it in his previous works, such as the 1962 publication of Capitalism and Freedom. This New York Times editorial was titled, "The Social Responsibility of Business is to Increase Its Profits." Now, in that article, he critiqued the current commonplace understandings of corporate social responsibility, which had CEOs and boards of directors making decisions about what kinds of organizations and programs and initiatives they would want to support. Friedman saw this as an illegitimate move that was effectively taking money out of the pockets of their shareholders, and instead of reinvesting it in the corporation so that their shareholders would be better off, either through dividend growth or increased valuation of their stock prices, instead they were diverting those funds to basically support pet projects that may or may not have any kind of strategic significance to this particular business. Moreover, Friedman was very forceful in making the claim that the market will discipline bad actors. So if a company becomes wholly irresponsible in its behavior, it will be driven out of business. Friedman does realize, though, that indeed a market-based approach may not bring forth the highest degree of ethical conduct on the part of businesses, But if you think of the alternative, and that would be having government force businesses to act in certain ways, he sees that as being deeply counterproductive. Now, despite the compelling nature of Friedman's editorial, there are problems with the market approach. One of these has been well recognized in economic theory and described as market failures, or sometimes this is referred to as externalities or neighborhood effects. The basic idea is this: in the process of producing certain goods and services and consuming those goods and services, there could be other individuals, other groups of people who would be uncompensated third parties that might either benefit or they may experience actual losses or costs associated with this process of producing goods and consuming goods. The classic example would be a pulp mill on a river, and in the process of producing paper, the paper company releases into the river untreated chemicals that pollute the water supply of a community downstream and lead to a higher incidence of susceptibility to different cancers. That process of disadvantaging that third party downstream in the process of actually making paper and consuming paper could be replicated across a number of different kinds of industries, and really does require some engagement of government to sort of come in and fix the problem, unless one could, under highly restrictive circumstances, get private individuals to bargain with one another. Like, say, the community downstream says, okay, we'll accept to having our polluted water supply as long as you pay us such and such an amount of money, or invest in our schools, or this or that or the next thing. But in most cases, those market failures are going to require the direct intervention of a government authority. Now, another problem with the market approach has to do with the degree to which the market can punish bad actors. And I would use my go-to case in point as the Exxon Valdez. As many of you may remember, the Exxon Valdez was this large supertanker that had run into an iceberg in Prince William Sound and destroyed much of the fisheries and seabirds because of the immense oil slick that it generated in this accident. And what's striking about this example is that, unlike other companies that at least try to express real interest and responsibility for trying to be part of the cleanup, in the case of Exxon, they drug their feet and at every point in terms of not compensating appropriately fishermen who lost their livelihoods, or being part of the massive effort to try to save seabirds whose feathers were coated in the oil, and to compensate communities for the lack of tourism. This was such a pristine, drop-dead gorgeous place that was destroyed temporarily by this large slick of oil. So, to what extent did the market punish Exxon for its bad behavior? And again, I'm not talking about the accident itself, even though there was negligence associated with that accident, but the wholly negligent approach that it took in terms of not responding in a timely fashion to help ameliorate the situation. What's striking is that many people at the time in which this accident occurred decided to cut up their Exxon credit cards because they were so fed up with with Exxon's behavior, and they swore to themselves that they wouldn't be buying any more Exxon gasoline. And I'm one of those persons who said that as well. And but then 2 years later, Exxon was doing fine. So it easily weathered the downturn in consumer anger directed to it, and was just fine later on. And so that really, I think, raises some substantial questions about whether through consumer boycotts, the market really can appropriately discipline bad actors. Moreover, what happens if we're talking about a product that is not sold on retail markets, but maybe in wholesale markets, and people are not familiar with brand names? How do they respond to trying to keep companies ethical who may not have much exposure in retail markets? That's a further problem. Another very interesting question that can be raised with the market approach is a question that is not all that obvious because of the fact that Milton Friedman's argument was so persuasive with so many people. It is believed in general today that the purpose of business is to make a profit. But truthfully, there is nothing in the legal machinery of corporation law that says that is the intended purpose of business. Now, you could say common sense would suggest that businesses are in existence to make a profit. But studies of really important businesses that have had a tremendous impact on our society and culture would indicate that yes, profitability is important, but that's not their purpose. Their purpose is to make a dent into the universe, a la Steve Jobs and other people who are really trying to change the world. And entrepreneurs like Elon Musk would also be in this category of somebody who one assumes is trying to make the world a better place and is motivated by factors that are not directly related to money. But again, I don't want to discount the importance of money and profitability. But is it natural? Is it necessarily the purpose of business to make money, or is there something else involved? Now, our next approach to corporate social responsibility is on the far right of the continuum, the regulatory approach, and would reflect a viewpoint where government would be more involved in the economy at large. And this approach is associated with the idea that the government has the responsibility to regulate corporations so that they are made to be moral, if you will, or to act in an ethical manner. And the gentleman pictured here, the late John Kenneth Galbraith, economist at Harvard, who also was the U.S. ambassador to India, was a very strong proponent of this regulatory approach. He wrote a book in 1967 called The New Industrial State, in which he maintained that it was the nature of corporate America that required some kind of government oversight so as to preserve democracy and preserve the temptation to centralize corporate power in advanced capitalist societies like the United States. In favor of the regulatory approach, unlike what most people believe, you can legislate morality. I know that seems odd to say that, but it is true. Oftentimes, people look to the law as a guide to morality, as we saw in the discussion of stage 4 in Lawrence Kohlberg's theory of moral development. So by using the law to say, no, this behavior is out of bounds, you're going to be punished for this, it gets people's attention, since most adults tend to be at stage 4. It's interesting that when you ask CEOs a typical question like, describe what business ethics is, the standard fair answer is going to be, business ethics is making a profit within the constraints of the law. So you're kind of looking at the law as setting the boundaries. So what is wrong with government using the law as a vehicle to shape behavior because it is so influential? Now, despite the common sense applicability of the regulatory approach, there are some very serious problems. One of these has to do with the problem of voluntary self-help regulation. And this is due to the fact that the industries that government needs to regulate are often so large and so complex in terms of their technical details, there is just not enough resources in the form of staff people and people with technical expertise to be able to regulate those industries. So they depend upon asking the industries for help in terms of regulating themselves. And often, this does work okay, but then there are some really stellar examples of when it does not work. And we have a case in point with the Boeing 737 MAX 8 series, where clearly Boeing did not responsibly regulate itself as they brought this new plane online and did not adequately prepare the pilots for the contingencies that have led, unfortunately, to the crashes of notable deaths in 2 instances involving this plane. We also have the problem of the next job. People who are government regulators don't anticipate working in government for all of their lives. They're thinking of going back into the industries that they came from. So that raises the problem, to what extent is a government regulator going to be appropriately critical of an industry that they know they're going to eventually go back into? And so that would tend to limit their objectivity. Also, in order for there to be a regulation, a law against something, there has to be a lot of really, really bad things that have happened and built up to the point that Congress creates a law, or that a regulatory agency adds to its body of regulatory law to say, no, you can't do this or that or the next thing. And so the nature of law means that the regulatory approach will not be forward-looking, but is more retrospective in orientation. And then we have the problem of compliance associated with multiple government agencies that may be issuing regulations that overlap with other agencies and that sometimes lead to contradictory directives. And the problem here is twofold. One, the tendency to disregard law because regulatory law, given its complexity, may be needlessly confusing or requiring a lot of expert interpretation. And two, the problem that basically we're talking about the potential of, instead of trying to bring about compliance to change in some regard, what we're doing is we're creating an industry of accountants and lawyers who are guiding companies into the gray area of regulation so that they can go ahead and pretty much walk up to the edge of the law and maybe cross over it from time to time, but not get caught, or maybe not cross over it, period. But the idea is that the concern is hiring people to skirt regulation as opposed to ascertaining the more direct question of, so what can we do to abide by this government regulation or another regulation in order to be a better company and and preserve the public safety, et cetera, et cetera. And then finally, we have something that I'm going to call the Ron Swanson effect. Those of you who are familiar with the series Parks and Recreation remember that basically Swanson is representing the government bureaucrat who really doesn't give a damn about people or the effectiveness of government. He's thinking much more about his own interest, contrasted with Leslie Knope, who is like, the classically devoted, good government bureaucrat who really wants to, believes in her work and really wants to see the best for people in the community. How many civil servants are of the Leslie Knope variety or the Ron Swanson variety? My view is actually that there are a lot of Leslie Knopes in government, and therefore we can have more confidence in government regulatory processes because of that. But you wouldn't want to be dumb about this, that there are certainly a good share of Ron Swansons that would tend to limit the effect of government regulation. Now, we turn to the corporate conscience approach, which is off the continuum and above it. The corporate conscience approach basically starts with this premise. We talk all the time about the corporation as being a fictitious person. Why not go one step further? Why not understand the corporation beyond this narrow legal sense and think of the corporation as a real person? One could look at the decision-making processes of corporations, the use of policies and board considerations, and say that in some respects we could have in corporate practices something that looks a lot like normal human rationality. And if the corporation can be rational in ways that human beings are rational, why couldn't a corporation have a conscience in the way that human beings have a conscience? And the way that this is generally interpreted is that corporations, due to their own unique organizational cultures, uphold certain values that are key to their identity, that they hold in such esteem that they are willing to sacrifice their own profitability in order to safeguard those values. That was the conclusion of a tremendously important study that was done in 1994 and reported in a book called Built to Last, that core values were much more important to the organizational strength and robustness of very important corporations that had long-standing runs and weathered through Great Depressions and variety of recessions and different product cycles, et cetera, et cetera. And as a consequence, these built-to-last companies survived and survived well in their stock values and in their the scope of contribution they've had in American society because of these organizational values. Now, despite the strengths of the corporate conscience approach, there are definite problems with this theory as well. And one of those is that all consciences are not created equal. Just like with humans, a person may have a conscience, but either they are not listening to their conscience or their conscience is not sensitive to the things that it should be sensitive to if they were truly acting out of moral insight and discernment as opposed to blindness. So a company, for instance, like Philip Morris, was identified by the authors of Built to Last as a primary example of a company that had strong corporate values, yet it was also dealing in a product that led to the unwarranted deaths and addiction of many millions of Americans. So how do you reconcile those two things? So this is a problem, definitely. It's also underscores the ease with which people can use business ethics to become a kind of resource for corporate window dressing that doesn't really address the real moral issues that should be talked about with respect to corporate social responsibility. For instance, the Philip Morris Company spends more advertising, telling other people about what it's doing in terms of its charitable contributions than actually putting the money into those charitable contributions, which obviously leads to a sense of skepticism that a company like this is not really that interested in change and constructively improving society, but is trying to cover themselves from potential areas of criticism because of the nature of the industry in which they're in. Now, there's a further problem associated with the corporate conscience approach that is not so much a problem, but I think it's kind of an interesting thing to think about, and that is, as a company stakes out more ethical territory as a company of conscience, it is more apt to be criticized because it's like calling attention to itself. It's inviting others to find weaknesses and contradictions between their stated values and how they actually behave. And truthfully, I don't think this is a problem because, it's like you are raising expectations, and those companies should meet those expectations that they're raising in the minds of the general public. But it is kind of contradictory, I suppose, in that if you keep your expectations low in terms of corporate social responsibility, you're probably not going to get criticized that much. So I think it's just something to be aware of. And then finally, we have the stakeholder approach, which is again off the continuum, but intentionally below the corporate conscience approach, because the idea here is the stakeholder approach is much more of a organic, decentralized, ground up approach to thinking about corporate social responsibility. Now, the stakeholder approach was most forcefully advocated by R. Edward Freeman in a classic book on strategic management in 1984. And so Freeman, in this case, is operating from a completely different paradigm than Milton Friedman in the market approach. And basically, Freeman argues for this. When we think of corporate governance, we need to think of groups other than stockholders if we're going to understand the proper relationship of the corporation, its situation in life in modern society. Corporations must not only consult and act in the interest of stockholders, but also other stakeholders. And these would include employees, customers, vendors, the larger community in which the corporation works, and yes, remarkably, even competitors. So the idea would be, with a stakeholder approach, we've got to figure out a way to bring these voices into the boardroom, bring them into our consideration as we think about the corporation and its policies, so that we can more intelligently decide matters when they will definitely affect our decisions will definitely affect these other stakeholder groups. The experience in Germany with the form of industrial organization known as co-determination would be a prime example of the value of a stakeholder approach. One thing that is very unique about the German experience is that companies above a certain size have to have as members of their board representatives from labor. And what's striking is that in the history of co-determination, often you will have both management and labor members at the board level making decisions that sometimes actually contradict the immediate direct interest of labor, but are decisions that are intended to put the company in the most economically stable position and competitive position possible, because people at the board level, employees, see the big picture and they recognize the need to make tough decisions that may not be popular with their other employees in the corporation. Now, having said that, there are problems with the stakeholder approach. The first problem is, are all stakeholders really created equal? What happens when we have stakeholder interests clash, like between stockholders versus employees or the surrounding communities? Plant relocation would be obviously a big example of where there could be a very direct conflict between the aims of stockholders and potentially customers as well versus employees in the community. So when these interests clash, who wins? And then there is the rather difficult question that I think needs to be raised. It is not so easily answered, but in the attempt to try to reflect a variety of positions in the boardroom context, is it possible through the give and take of stakeholder management and dialogue to arrive at really difficult strategic decisions that might be necessary for the company to survive and thrive? Does the stakeholder model provide a foundation for the difficult organizational decision that saves the company, for instance? And I think this is an area where the jury is out on this particular approach. So that concludes our discussion of corporate social responsibility. Thank you so much for joining me.